You mentioned Enlightenment, which is another word for you.
Yeah, I mean the Enlightenment. It is one of those contested concepts that is now becoming back, and I said very contested because are you pro Enlightenment, are you pro or con, are you against the Enlightenment? And in some sense, it is akin to the notion of the postmodern or the modern in that sense that because when Jean-François Lyotard proposed the idea of the postmodern, he in some cases he understood it as being a self-critique of the Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment as the kind of philosophical and scientific and political principles that we inherited from the late 18th century that he thought were being questioned or undermined basically in the post-war period in the 20th century. So the Enlightenment became something which was not simply a historical category. The Enlightenment is something that happened during the 18th century, like the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, but it was something that was still going on, and we need to take stance. Are you pro or con the Enlightenment? And I think this was largely fueled by an article by Jürgen Habermas in 1981, which is called "The Enlightenment: An Unfinished Project." And this had a particular context because he wrote that. He wrote that as a response to the Venice Architecture Biennale in Venice in 1980, which was curated by Paolo Portoghesi, who was an Italian scholar. I know he's still alive, I think he is. Scholar, architecture historian. It was called The Presence of the Past. And in that exhibition, Portoghesi, he was a curator. You had all these combinations of paraphernalia from the classical tradition, from Renaissance architecture combined with pop art. You had these installations where you could see kind of eclectic mix of all types of architecture, all kinds of architectural styles. And for Portoghesi, the postmodern meant eclecticism. I think that now, the modernity and modernism was a story of progress towards rationality. Now this history has stopped. We had entered some kind of post-historical phase. This is why you can combine all kinds of things from the past. It's not entirely dissimilar to the stuff that was called postmodern painting, where you say you can go back and reclaim old styles, expressionism and whatnot. So, and Habermas said we need to understand the Enlightenment, he said modernity, not Enlightenment. Modernity as this is titled, Die Moderne, ein unvollendetes Projekt. So modernity was an unfinished project, but he connected strongly modernity to the Enlightenment. He said modernity is a continuation of the Enlightenment, which is why postmodern is reactionary. It is reactionary because it denies progress, and it is reactionary in all senses, philosophically, politically, etc. And he would align in that article many of the new French philosophers, people like Derrida and Foucault and others, say that they are counter-enlightenment, counter-modernity, thus they are reactionary, they belong to some new right, which is of course completely crazy given, if you look at the political context in France. But still, that article, I would guess, not because of what he says about architecture, because that's pretty uninteresting, but because of Habermas' standing, in political and scientific discourse, he was widely read, and it sparked this discourse about the Enlightenment. What is your position towards the Enlightenment? And I remember Foucault did a nice interview a couple of years later where he said that, this question, are you for or against the Enlightenment? It's a kind of blackmail. He says, are you against the Enlightenment? What does it mean? Enlightenment is something that began in the 18th century, still goes on, has been questioned in many respects. And it's like saying, are you for or against the Middle Ages? I don't know what it means. It exists. And we are inside the process of Enlightenment, which still goes on. But so in that sense, Enlightenment, I would say I would prefer to, when you say an unfinished project, you have a certain normative concept on Enlightenment. And Enlightenment means to have certain positions in philosophy or in politics. But if you look at the actual Enlightenment, these positions were there, but also many opposing positions. So as a historical phenomenon, the Enlightenment is not one particular thing that you can be for or against. So it's a kind of persuasive definition, as you say, of the Enlightenment, but I've been interested in the Enlightenment for many other reasons myself, because it's also, it is the origin of modernity in many senses, and it's the origin of many questions that we still perceive to be highly relevant, and it is the time when the old idea of let's put it, the old idea of a unified science. This is a term from the 20th century from Carnap, but the idea of a unified science you find in Descartes, the mathematical science that would describe all the universe, breaks down, and you have this proliferation of multiple new ways of addressing the world: aesthetics, politics, religion, ethics, and all of the kind of unified landscape that was part of rationalism from the 17th century breaks up. And suddenly that's a problem. How should we relate the aesthetic to the ethic? How should we relate ethic to politics? How should we relate politics to religion? Because all these spheres begin to somehow drift apart. So the problem of the Enlightenment, if one can say it in a very, of course, in a generalized sense, is how can we unify this archipelago of different discourses that begin to come apart. And so this would be the Enlightenment problem. And this is an unfinished project, of course, but because it cannot be finished. It cannot be finished because these discourses develop. I mean, the physics and the natural science of the 18th century are surely not the one of the 20th century, and and the arts are not different. So the project of unification, or of understanding the connections between these, as it were, the islands in this archipelago, will stay with us forever. But I think the Enlightenment, from my point of view, is particularly interesting because it is the origin of what we term aesthetics, what we call the autonomy of the arts, and also all the problems that are connected to this autonomy. I mean, problems like, if art is autonomous, does it mean anything to ethics? Does art have a political impact? Should art be treated as a sphere on its own without connections to other spheres? All of those questions emerged in the Enlightenment, and art, or discussions about art, artists, criticism, all these different types of ways of speaking about art developed as autonomous. You had art criticism that suddenly appeared as a way of writing about art, for instance in the writings of Diderot. How should you write about art? Well, you can write in all kinds of ways, and the art criticism that emerged was a kind of child born in sin, as you might say. It combined moral philosophy, personal reflections, literary excursions, personal attacks. It was a completely mixed genre, and it still is. So if we're still debating what should art criticism look like, of course we're doing that because when it emerged, it didn't look like anything. It combined all kinds of ways of speaking and writing. And you have the development of aesthetics as a philosophical discipline. Can philosophy describe or analyze what we do and what we experience when we look at particular artworks? This is a new type of discourse that hadn't existed before. We have development you had the idea of the fine arts as being a separate sphere, separated from the practical arts, from etc. And you find that in the French encyclopedia. You find the development of art history, that you can say that there is something called art, but this strange phenomenon called art has a history, which is not the history of individual artists that you would find in the Renaissance, for instance, like Vasari, but history is something which somehow goes on behind the back of the artist. And you can actually say art develops, and this development is expressed in individual artists, which is a totally new phenomenon. When Vasari wrote his great work on the Renaissance art, he would construe it as a series of biographies, artist A, B, C, D. Now there is something called the history of art, which is now Winkelmann's great book on the art of antiquity. There's a Geschichte der Kunst des Altertums, which develops on its own. This is Winkelmann. It's a very fascinating story, because Winkelmann, when he came to Rome, he was charged with cataloging and classifying and dating fragments. And these fragments were anonymous. You didn't know who made them. So he had to invent the idea that there is something like an artistic style which develops on its own. And you can say that this fragment is must be located 150 BC, because it looks like other works that we know are from 150 BC. So the artwork is not the expression of an artist, but it's the expression of a style that exists, as it were, beyond the individual artist. And this is, so you can write a history of styles, not of artists' lives. And this is an entirely new concept. So you find history, aesthetics, criticism, autonomy of art, all of that emerged as a new field in the middle of the 18th century. So it's just one way. This is what I've been working on myself for the last years. But I mean, this is one way of saying or showing that problems emerge in the Enlightenment that are still with us. How do we connect philosophy, criticism, artistic work, can they be combined? Which is an entirely new problem. And so all of these problems just exploded on the scene in the 18th century. And this is why we are still in the Enlightenment. It makes, to me, absolutely no sense to say you are against or for the Enlightenment. It's just space that we still inhabit.